Good evening, councillors. I'd like to declare the agenda briefing open at 6 p.m. It's Tuesday, the 1st of December 2020, and welcome to everybody in the public gallery. I start, of course, by acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of the land. We also pay our respects, of course, to elders both past and present. Tonight's meeting is for the purpose of asking questions and seeking clarification on agenda items for the next ordinary council meeting, which will be held next Tuesday evening. No decision making or entering into debate is to occur at this meeting. May I ask everyone present this evening to turn off all electronic devices, mobile phones, iPads and tablets for the duration of the briefing. Tonight's agenda is being recorded. A copy of the audio recording shall be available on the city's website within 72 hours of the meeting. Agenda briefings are public meetings and any information you provide may be publicly accessible. With relation to disclosures of interest, the prescribed disclosure requirements apply to meetings that are convened under the provisions of the Local Government Act. However, it may be perceived as ethically unacceptable and at odds with the probity and accountability principles of the Act and codes of conduct for elected members to participate in forums, briefings or workshops where they are aware they have a conflict of interest and do not declare it. In the interests of openness and accountability, elected members are encouraged to please disclose a conflict of interest where they are aware that they have one when attending a forum, briefing or workshop, and where applicable, remove themselves from the room while the matter is being discussed. At item 2, attendance, I'm pleased to say we have the full council in attendance tonight. Thank you, councillors. Approved leave of absence, there is none. At item 3, disclosures of interest. Chief Executive Officer, do we have any disclosures?
Thank you, Mayor. No, I have not received any disclosures.
Thank you, CEO. We'll move on to item 4 on the agenda, which is question time for the public. Responses to previous questions taken on notice. Responses to previous questions taken on notice will be noted in the ordinary council meeting agenda. At item 2, questions from the public. The time set aside for public questions is 15 minutes, which may be extended if necessary. A question asked tonight must relate to items on tonight's agenda paper. For recording purposes, please state your name and address and then proceed to ask your question. If an answer cannot be provided at tonight's meeting, the question will be taken on notice and an answer will be provided at the next ordinary council meeting. In accordance with policy AD02, members of the public who have registered their interest to ask questions with the city's administration shall be called upon in the order in which registrations were received. Written questions will precede verbal questions. I open public question time tonight at 6:03 p.m. Are there any questions from the gallery before I move on? Mr. Aldridge, yes, please step forward.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council, Directors. Is CC 075-20 confidential tonight? That's the CEO one.
No, it's not.
Okay, thank you. My second question is, why wasn't the reserve 27733 amalgamated with reserve 27767? This is the Nudie Park stream. Why wasn't that amalgamated before we did the living stream?
Director Adams or Director Bowe? Director Bowe in the first instance?
I'm happy to take that question on notice, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Council.
Thank you, Mr. Aldridge. Mrs. Aldridge?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, councillors, CEO and administrators. My first question is, where were the changes of the dates for the agenda and the ordinary council meetings advertised for this month?
Sorry to be pedantic. I'll just get you to state your name and just...
Oh, sorry, Marnie Aldridge, 5 Minota Avenue in Shelley. I might repeat the question. Where were the changes for the dates for this agenda meeting and the OCM advertised?
Thank you. Director Adams?
I'll take it on notice, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. I did look on the City of Canning website. They weren't there, and on Facebook. So if it wasn't advertised, how are the ratepayers supposed to know that the meeting dates have changed?
Director?
I'll take it on notice, Mr. Mayor.
And my last question, when you vote on the actual date, the meeting dates, this on the website I had officially that next week was the agenda briefing and this for the following week was the OCM. So if it is changed, can it please be changed on the council website? And also, if it's going to be changed for Christmas, could next year's December please be organised earlier? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mrs Aldridge. Appreciate that. Any other questions from the public? Thank you, Steve. Mr Walker, come forward.
All right, Steve Walker, 22 Farnham Street, Bentley. First two questions are in relation to item 7.4, which is Burrendar Park Auxiliary Works. Okay, in reference to the agenda briefing page 43 and 44, in brief, reason 2, Willetton Sports Precinct Upgrade and Development, reasons 3, 4 and 5. What has City of Canning provided for hockey, a high participation female and male sport and Olympic sport that Australia has world achievement and success for?
Director Bowe.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Could I just clarify, is Mr Walker referring specifically to within the Willetton Sports Precinct or across the City of Canning broadly?
I am referring to the Willetton Sports Precinct Upgrade and Development.
There is no proposal to upgrade the facilities for hockey at the Burrendar Park or in any way associated with the Willetton Sports Precinct at the moment, Mr Walker.
Your second question, Mr Walker.
Okay, question 2. Why has the City of Canning kept hidden and never publicly released the information, the non-consultations and feedback associated with, and I'm quoting here, the 2019 Burrendar Park Auxiliary Works Landscape Master Plan, further investigation of the Willetton Sports Precinct concept, including extensive stakeholder engagement, plus the March 2020 consultation?
I'm not certain we've kept it hidden, but nevertheless, I'll get the Director to respond if he's able to.
Thank
Director
you,
Bowe.
Mr Mayor. The Willetton Sports Precinct and the Burrendar Park Ancillary Works, which preceded that, were the subject of a significant engagement process with all the stakeholders in and around the sports precinct. It's not a matter for the public record, nor is it something that we've chosen to hide from the public, Mr Mayor. There are significant notes and records of meetings that have been had with the relevant stakeholders across the precinct over, certainly in my time the last couple of years, as we've gone to deliver the sports precinct in conjunction with the relevant groups in that area.
Your final question, Mr Walker. Thank you.
It's in regards to the CEO selection item. Okay. In regards to City of Canning having council members from 2016 to 2019, can someone on council please tell us what are the attributes of a good local government authority chief executive officer that collectively council members have been saying amongst each other during your informal meetings, workshops, etc. of the past few years, so the public can understand your reasonings?
Yeah, I can only say as the Mayor that it's a fairly subjective and very broad question. Those decisions in relation to what this council actually requires of its next CEO will be fleshed out by this council as a collective. We are only discussing the matter for the first time tonight, Mr Walker, as you appreciate, so you can shake your head, but early in the new year we'll have some answers for you. The advertisement for the position will touch on the attributes that we feel are required of our next CEO.
I feel as though it's been discussed for the past few years. Just share some of the attributes.
It hasn't been, and I won't, but thank you for your question. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. I'll close public question time now. It's 6:10 p.m. Thank you. Deputations, we're pleased to have a deputation tonight at item 4.3 from Mr Matt Stewart from Planning Outcomes WA regarding item SD 028 of 20, The title of that item tonight is Initiation of Scheme Amendment number 3 to Local Planning Scheme number 42 to 105 Manning Road, in brackets lot 999, Bentley. Mr. Stewart, would you like to step forward? The microphone is magically on for you already. You have up to 10 minutes to make your deputation. Please go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't have a visual presentation, it's just an informal talk, just to introduce the project. So thank you, Council, for your time, and also the City's Planning Department for the processing of this application. They've been very friendly and helpful. As the applicant of this proposal, we support in full the recommendation by the administration to initiate this scheme amendment. In overview, our client currently runs a liquor franchise in the Manning Road local centre. They purchased the adjoining residential subject site with a view of demolishing the house and rebuilding with a 2-storey mixed-use building for themselves. The future building would contain a liquor store and possibly a cafe on the ground floor, and their private residence on the upper floor. The liquor licence is owned by the client and will transfer to the new building, resulting in only one liquor store in the local centre, which could be a concern of the community. The current zoning of residential, however, does not permit liquor store or cafe land uses, but the adjoining zone does. If the site was included in the neighbouring zone, then the proposal can be considered by the council at a later date through a DA. And this is the sole objective of the scheme amendment. It's quite simple, really. In support of this, it's noted that the locality already has a mixed character streetscape, including several cafes and liquor, on a busy distributor road. The nearby Bentley regeneration project aims to introduce 1,500 to 1,800 additional dwellings, as well as community facilities. The surrounding residential area is coded R80, which is quite high, which also will result in a large number of additional dwellings. The locality is under a restricted use scheme provision, forcing redevelopments to have multiple dwelling uses. The local centre is looking a little tired, and the redevelopment that's proposed could be a catalyst to update the whole local centre. So the character of the locality is set to change significantly in the short term, with a large number of redevelopments, dwellings, and an increased local shopping demand. In conclusion, we feel that the proposed expansion of the centre and proposed land uses responds to this increasing demand and the scheme incentives to redevelop. This motion is only to initiate the process, resulting in returned referrals and community consultation to be presented to the council for its final decision. And I'm available for your questions if you have any.
Councillor, is there any questions in relation to this matter before we move on, and thank Mr. Stewart for his time? Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Thanks very much for coming in. The matter will be discussed a little later on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, at item 5, there are no items to be brought forward for the convenience of members of the public tonight. Reports of committee meetings, there are none. There are 2 late items at item 7. There are 2 late items that have yet to be circulated. They will be made available and included in the agenda for the ordinary council meeting on the 8th of December. Those late items are the monthly financial report for November, that's CCO 720, and CCO 7520, the Chief Executive Officer recruitment item. Item 7.1 are reports from the Chief Executive Officer. There are none. At item 7.2, the responsible officer is Mr. Gary Adams, the Director of Canning Corporate and Commercial, and the item is CCO 67 of 20. The title of that item is Review of Procurement Policies AF 301, Procurement of Goods and Services, and FM 09, Pre-Qualified Panel of Suppliers. The recommendation is on page 4 of tonight's agenda and is on the screen. Councillors, do we have any questions in relation to that item? Councillor Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Director Adams. As AF 301, is the only legislative requirement the tender threshold Is that the only one that's changed in that? Or is it other legislative?
Director Adams, you able to answer that?
I'm not sure it's the only one, but I can get David McGarvey, who's the leader of procurement, to let us know whether that's the case.
David, can you come forward, please, and just, if you're able to, provide an answer for Councillor Barry?
Good evening, Mr Mayor and Councillors. So the tender threshold under legislation has increased from 150,000 to 250,000, and that is reflected in the amended policy. The
question is that the only one? Yeah?
correct. That's the only,
Legislative change.
that's the only legislative change.
So the other question I have there, Mr Mayor, is that in relation to the our panel of suppliers, and I'll ask a question further down the track tonight. Essentially, is everything that we've got now still legislatively correct?
Director Adams.
So for the panel of suppliers policy, it was felt that when we first introduced it, because it was a legislative requirement. It came in as a legislative requirement in 2017, I think it was. So we introduced a specific policy for that. Now it's deemed more appropriate that it just forms part of our procurement policy. So we don't need to have a separate policy, but we need to have a policy that details how we handle our supplier panel contracts.
So as I read it, I mean, basically what we're wanting to introduce through the combination of the two is goes to a WELGA template, and I think it says somewhere in there that a few other local governments, do they have the same word for word, or what?
Director?
So we've used the WELGA template as a basis for reviewing our policy and looking at best practice across the local government sector. So we believe that the policy that's in front of you now is reflective of all of the legislative requirements, plus the best practice to enable us to have the most robust procurement policy that we can have.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone else before we move on? Councillor Holland?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Can you tell me, is there any reason why we do not have to go, by still using a WELGA template to a certain extent, why we do not have to go to using the WELGA predetermined panel? Can't we send our own panel up rather than going to theirs?
Director Adams, we're not obligated to use the panel, are we?
We make a determination as to whether to use the WELGA panel, and the WELGA panel of suppliers is considered in our procurement decisions. However, we're not obliged to use it. We will look at what option is likely to provide the best value for money in terms of the procurement decision that we're undertaking.
Councillor Holland?
So we can actually bypass that panel and go to our own panel and go out to tender just like any other thing else without going to theirs. And how, if I wanted to, how could we make that a council motion to do such a thing and not go through the WELGA panel?
That might be a question best left for after tonight, but Director, just in the first instance, just in relation to the first part of that question.
Yeah. So council could...
Hang on, just one second.
Council could make...
I've got a rule on the relevance of the question. The question is in relation to this item. So you asking for the Director to help you to form a motion is not directly related to this item on the agenda. So I'm just asking you that it's not relevant to tonight. So that's my ruling, but it should be just taken offline. Director?
So as I said, we're not obliged to use the WELGA panel. However, there are some significant benefits in using WELGA preferred supplier panels in terms of some of the more complex procurement processes that we undertake, because the pre-qualified panel of suppliers has a quality assurance framework around it through WOLGA that gives us assurance that some of the work that we would need to be doing in terms of that quality assurance has already been done. We use that, I'll be clear, we use that, but we use the WOLGA supply panels when we deem that they are going to present the best procurement outcome for the city. There are some instances where there is a panel of WOLGA, and we also may have our own panel of suppliers, but a lot of the WOLGA panels are done so that it creates efficiencies across local government, so that each local government is not duplicating doing a whole lot of the quality assurance stuff, but also things like terms and conditions and that sort of stuff, which are already in those supplier panels. So there are, as I said, the council could direct us not to use WOLGA panels, but I think that would be to the detriment of our procurement processes.
Councillor Holland.
Could you use your microphone, please, Councillor Holland?
Nothing more.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else, councillors, before we move on? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to CCO 69 of 20, prospective disposal of number 9 Longhurst Way in Queen's Park. The recommendation is on page 2 of the late circulated report and is on the screen right now. Councillors, please note this report was actually listed under confidential matters in the agenda. However, it is no longer considered confidential as it relates to a proposed land transaction with a state government agency and therefore is not subject to commercial confidentiality. Any questions on that item, please? Councillor Barry.
Yeah, well, you probably caught me on the hop a little bit. Just as I read it, and correct me if I'm wrong, if option 2 was what council decided to go with, are we saying then that after a sum of $600,000 spent for the subdivision works, that we would then be looking at only a possible $200,000 windfall? And secondly, what would the $600,000 entail?
Director Adams.
So I'll ask Chris O'Connor to come and answer that question.
Mr. O'Connor, could you step forward, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you. So the expected profit based on the more detailed financial feasibility would indicate about a $200,000 return once the subdivision costs have been fulfilled. The subdivision costs include everything from connecting utilities to the site, servicing all the lots, constructing fencing, the driveway. There's quite an exhaustive list of items that we were determined with the assistance of a professional construction estimator. And somewhere in there I read that the city believes of itself that we don't have the expertise to go through that. Is that correct?
Mr. O'Connor.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Certainly we have the ability to do it. The comment about the expertise would be more to do with the expediency and the efficiency by which someone who specialised in development would be able to deliver those lots to the market. So it's more about a timing thing. City could certainly do it. It would just take a lot longer. And given the economic stimulus and the benefits that would come from delivering those lots earlier, we think it's a worthwhile proposition.
So essentially, if we were going to go with option 2, we would be looking at something further down the track anyway. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, if I understand the question correctly, yeah, it would likely be that it would be a couple of years before those lots are brought to the market.
And the other thing is, from developing this particular block, how would that differ from the way we're going to do Hillview? I presume we're going to put that out to tender, and whoever we find is the best or the best price, etc., they would then go ahead. And I'm just wondering, would that be the same applicable, or could be the same applicable to this block?
Director Adams.
So if you're talking about the Hillview hub, the multicultural centre, that will be a construction contract, not a subdivision civil works contract. So that's a construction project, which is different to what we're talking about here.
Essentially, it's the same. I mean, we're going to get a builder or a developer, a builder for one, a developer for the other.
I'm not sure if he said it's the same, Director Adams. I think he said the opposite.
So we would have to go out and buy the expertise in to do that, just as we are. So we'd have to go through a tender process. Yes, we're going through a tender process for Hillview to get the construction works done there.
The other question, if we go with option one, the TPS contributions will be paid by the government, or are they exempt from that?
Director Bride.
Yeah, through Mr. Mayor, I'll take that one on notice and get back to all councillors.
Okay, and just to finish off, on my, like I said, you caught me on the hop, but I think that'll do for now. I may have to ask a couple more questions at the next meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, the Director just said before then would be preferable, just so they can make sure they've got the information for you, if you're able to.
Well, how will the public answer to the question, Mr. Mayor?
You're not using your microphone again, so they won't know what you've just asked.
Said, how will the public know the answer to that question, Mr. Mayor?
Well, Director?
So, I would have thought that if you're asking a question, you're asking it because you need the information to make the decision. So, you could ask it and we could give you the answer, and then you could ask it again in a public forum, but at least we'd have the answer for you.
The other question, just for the double clarification, is that if we go with the Department of Communities, well, there's two actually. I thought of another one. So, if we go with Department of Communities, we'll find out who pays the town planning scheme fees. But in here it says there will be no rates; they will be exempt.
That question was already asked and answered at the SIB, I believe, wasn't it? Is that true?
So it depends on what model they use. What they're looking to do is build affordable housing. Now, some of that will be potentially shared equity. Some of it will be through Key Start loans. They may retain some for community housing, but their intent is to build affordable housing, in which case they would be owned by individuals, in which case they would, in most cases, not qualify for exemption from rates.
One final question, and I don't know whether the land utilisation team has been through it, because I don't read it in here, but was the idea of maybe doing a land swap with that for, say, a property up on the corner of Catherine and John Street considered?
Director?
Or land swap per se?
No, we put this out to expression of interest, and they were one of the proponents that came forward with an offer. Their offer happens to be the best offer that we received, so we're presenting it to council.
So there was more than one person who made an offer for the block?
They're actually, those three parties are listed in the report, I think, aren't they?
Paragraph 14 of the report, Department of Communities 1.16 was their initial offer, final offer 1.238. Respondent 2, 1 million option, and then respondent 3 put forward 2 options. we considered that Department of Communities was the best offer put forward.
Mr O'Connor, can I just ask a question, just following on from what Councillor Barry asked, just in relation to option 2, if the city was to consider over a period of years developing that block, what would be the costs of the development and where would those funds come from? To construct 10 units on site, I would have expected there'd be a considerable cost, and how would that be funded? Would that come from reserve, or what would be the proposition?
Mr Mayor, to clarify, to actually for the city to build dwellings on those lots?
That's right, isn't that what the option was, that we would actually develop it ourselves?
The intention by doing the subdivision was that we would sell the individual lots as vacant parcels to members of the public, anyone who was interested in buying those. It wasn't for us to build dwellings on the block as part of the original discussion with council when that was considered.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. Option 2 shows a cost of additional amount, 425,000 for the development. Would it be expected that we'd get option 2 may in the long term see a better return for our investment? Would that be a correct understanding? My understanding would be correct, even though the outlay is more?
Director Adams.
Potentially, yes, but as you know, things can change quite rapidly in the property market, so it all depends on timing as to whether you realise the predicted returns or not. I guess the other consideration is that there is a significant amount of risk incurred in doing those sort of developments, and so you've got to weigh up the return, the risk versus the return.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. If there's no other questions, we'll move on to the next one. Councillor Sweeney.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. Just one quick question. Do we know, Mr Mayor, through you, do we know whether or not the Department of Communities has any other properties in Queen's Park or multiplex sites that are owned by the Department of Communities?
Yes, I imagine they have quite a few. I know they're on our mapping system, so we can provide you with all the properties there in Queen's Park.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor.
Terrific, thank you. Councillors, we'll move on now to CCO 71 of 20. The title of that report is Land Assembly to support Nerdy Park Living Stream project. The officer's recommendation is on page 23 of tonight's agenda and is also on the screen in front of you all. Councillors, are there any questions on that item? None, thank you. We move on to CCO 72 of 20, the title being New Lease at the Shelley Sailing Club. The officer's recommendation is on page 28 of tonight's agenda. Councillors, any questions in relation to that item? No, thank you. We move on. Councillors, CCO 74 of 20, the title being Submissions Received, Proposed Disposal of Part Lot 1 in brackets 233 Seven Oak Street in Cannington. The officer's report is on, the officer's recommendation is on page 2 of the late circulated report and is on the screen. It is right now. Councillors, are there any questions in relation to that item? Councillor Barry.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. In the new one, the figure has changed from 300 to 175. Is there a reason for that?
Director Adams, just a discrepancy, is there one?
Yep, so in consultation with the City Centre team, there was an amount of works that can be picked up as part of the work that they're doing on the Lake Street extension, and therefore in looking at the works that they're doing on the Lake Street extension and what could be picked up as part of that project, the amount that would be required specifically for developing this lot and not as part of the servicing of other parks was 175. So we've specifically allocated that 175. The rest would be picked up as part of the works that they're doing as part of the city centre project.
So that would mean that that undergrounding of those power lines would be essentially $125,000, or is it just part of the Cecil Avenue works?
Director?
I'll get Chris O'Connor to speak on that. He is
Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you. So the $125,000 that was being allocated now to the city centre covers the sewer extension from Cecil Avenue up Lake Street. It also includes water from Cecil and Sevenoaks, and the underground power was never included in the original figure. So there's a little bit of reconciliation as far as some of the other associated mobilisation costs as well that are factored into the 125, but that's where the bulk of it is the sewer and the water.
I seem to remember when this first came up, part and parcel of the reasoning with the $300,000 was one of the problems was the power lines above, so it must have come up somewhere in discussions.
Just need you to ask a question there. What was the question?
In the original, when we looked at this originally, the power lines above the block were considered to be a concern. Now they're not.
So your question is, are they no longer a concern? Yeah. Mr. O'Connor?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So the power lines, the undergrounding of the power has always been a project that's been committed to by the city centre. That was never factored into the figures in the previous reports. The costs to establish a development-ready lot were primarily sewer, water, and the other general earthworks to be able to reconfigure the car park and to deliver the lot through the subdivision process. So there was reference made to it in previous discussions, but that was never part of the figure.
All right, thank you. I'll have to double check that. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a question myself, might be one that you won't be able to answer. There are only 3 submissions received in relation to this matter. One was from a Mr. Tilley. The second one, I don't think the person that submitted it has been identified. I'm just wondering if we could work a little bit harder to try and identify that person before it comes to council next week. It seems to have been the second submission, seems to be a cut and paste from Mr. Tilley's. I'm wondering whether it's a duplication of the same submission, whether they have both been made inadvertently by Mr. Tilley. I'm just wondering whether we can perhaps contact Mr. Tilley and find out. They're almost identical. Okay, that was my question.
Mr. Mayor, I'd be happy to dig a little further on that. It's just based on the information in the submission, it was just a signature, not a listed name.
I think if people go to the trouble of making a submission, we should really try to acknowledge their contribution if we can. Anyone else before we move on? Councillor Holland, yes, go ahead.
Thank you. The first question I've got, why are we doing this on our least preferred option of selling land, which I think is called by treaty, which was discussed last week, that this is actually our least preferred option? Another question is, the $4,000 for the car parking, am I correct that works out about $1 a day? That's all. The third question is everybody else aware of what the council was going to do as far as works prior to that to make it acceptable, as opposed to just THECAN, who are aware of what the council was going to do? In other words, the electricity, the sewage, everything else.
Director Adams,
is that common knowledge?
Do you understand that?
As we said, this was a direct approach from THECAN, and being a unique piece of land, and I think in the new valuation that we've got, it even mentions what some of the constraints are, and therefore what the uses are, that they approached us directly with an offer. We've worked with them to get to a point where we believe it's an offer that can be put in front of council. and therefore it's there for council to make a decision on. If council wants to go down another path, then we can, and we can advertise the lot. But our view is, by doing that, probably won't result in any better outcome. So we would be open and transparent with anyone who approached us about this parcel of land and what the constraints and what the needs are in terms of getting it to a development site, just as we have with Thican. So that's all I can say, really.
Councillor Holland.
The $4,000 part?
So when this previously came to council, there was some conversation with council about getting some contribution to the parking. $4,000 for having access to, I think it's 10 parking bays, whatever that works out to per day, but it's a contribution that we wouldn't otherwise have for parking bays that are predominantly left empty during the day, and it'll be an ongoing contribution through the life of that building.
Deputy Mayor. Oh, sorry, I'll come back to you, Councillor Holland. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. If point 2 is not approved, can the project still proceed? And if so, how? And then I've got a second question after that.
Director.
Well, given that we need to do the works to make the lot developable, then I would think that if point 2 wasn't approved, then we wouldn't be able to progress with the sale because the lot wouldn't be in a developable state for the developer.
Yes, Deputy Mayor.
Second question, final one. How would that leave Thican? Would they have a plan B? Would they be able to help with that, or has there been any discussion in that area?
Director, would we know?
More than likely they'd walk away.
Councillor Holland, I'll come back to you and then I'll come to Councillor Barry. Councillor Holland?
Yeah, my final question is, if we really didn't think the price was going to, or get a better offer, or the price was going to change, why didn't we put it out to a public tender anyway, which is our preferred option, as stated last week?
Director Adams.
I don't think we've ever stated that public tender is a preferred option. Public tender is one option that's available to us, and it's used in certain circumstances. If you go back and review that presentation that was given last week, generally we go to expressions of interest, but there are always circumstances where people are approaching us for land that the city owns and looking at potential uses, whether it's to lease or buy. This is one of those circumstances where a piece of land that we weren't actively marketing has been seen as an opportunity for a particular development that we see as complementary to our existing leisureplex. That's why it's been brought to council. Tenders will be used in certain circumstances. Private treaty has been used previously by this council. Expressions of interest are used, as are other marketing avenues. So what we need to do, though, is be open and transparent in what we're doing, which we are, and we go through the advertising process as prescribed by the Local Government Act to ensure that everybody is aware of what we're doing. As you can see, through that process, we've received 3 submissions.
Thank you. Councillor Barry, did you still have a question?
Thank you. If council chose to go down that track where they would ask for expressions of interest from a number of other people, would all those conditions that are currently in this one, would they still be there for everybody to read, and because possibly we may get a better price out of it?
Director Adams.
Well, I'm not sure what I'm not sure what the councillor's asking.
Question is if council doesn't go ahead with this and we put it out to expression of interest to the general public to buy this, would all those conditions that are currently within this one, would they be available to anybody else?
You're saying if we advertise it for as an expression of interest, would these be attached to
Yes,
the advertisement?
those same conditions.
Yeah.
So what conditions are you referring to, Councillor Barry?
Whatever the conditions in number 42 were in the last one. The parking concessions, etc., etc., etc.
Well, so I think we'd be fairly stupid to go out and advertise it for expression of interest with conditions that are relevant to a particular business model. That would be one way of ensuring that you didn't get the best price, because it would have a whole lot of conditions that weren't relevant to people's intended use. So I think if you're going out to expression of interest, you'd do it for proposals, just like what we've got here, that would be that people would put forward in terms of what suits their own business model and what they wanted to put on there. We wouldn't put it out with conditions that were specific to a specific use and a specific business model.
Well, I'm not quite understanding, so is the answer there yes or no? So the conditions that were applicable to the THICAN.
I think the director's saying that those conditions were negotiated in relation to the needs and wants of this particular proponent. So if we went to advertise it again, we would advertise it expression of interest and wait and see what came in from that. We wouldn't wrap it up in all sorts of conditions and restrictions. Is that,
That's exactly what I'm saying, because another proponent might want to put something that requires 20 or 30 car bays on there, or might have different requirements for utilities, or might have completely different requirements as to how they're going to configure the site. So no, we wouldn't put those conditions on it, and I think it would be foolhardy to do so.
So it wouldn't be apples with apples?
No, we would. I'm hearing that we would start the process from the start again. So we would advertise an expression of interest for expressions of interest and see what came in.
And would the city itself then be doing those development works as well, or not? Or is this just going to be a complete blank canvas?
Director?
So I wouldn't recommend saying no to this offer and then going ahead and doing all the works, because it may be 10 years before somebody else is interested in buying the site. You may as well do them when somebody is interested in the site. I wouldn't be going and spending the money doing it and then having additional costs that the city's borne sitting there for potentially 5, 6, 7, 10 years.
But hypothetically, that may be the same with THICAN, because as I read this, it won't be anywhere near ready to go for 2 years. And at that rate, we would be buying it back off, wouldn't we?
Yeah, we actually do need a question. I mean, we kind of don't deal in hypotheticals here, so...
I know, well, I mean, Director Adams was dealing in a hypothetical. I'm just, saying, well, if you can say it's going to take 10 years, I might ask, well, what would be the
Well, I guess the block of land's been sitting there now for 10 years on our strategic asset register and available for purchase at any time, and this is the first offer, I believe, that we've had in 10 years, so, it's not like we've hidden away this block of land.
But once again, Mr Mayor, if I can offer it, that land was left there for the city at that particular time, for the city to consider a short stay accommodation that they would build for themselves. That's what it was there for.
Yeah, not sure about that. So let's move on. If you've got a question, but
No, leave it at that. Thank you.
Roger. Any other questions, councillors, before we move on? Thank you. Let's move on. We'll move on to 7.3. The responsible officer is Mr. Graham Bride, the Director of Canning Development. The officer's report is SD 028 of 20, the title being Initiation of Scheme Amendment number 3 to Local Planning Scheme number 42, being 105 Manning Road, Lot 999 at Bentley. And just for the record, for the purpose of the recording, Councillor Sabiri has just considered a position. I think you may have some connection to... Councillor Sabiri, I won't speak for you.
Sorry, no, I just ran it past the CEO and it said it's not necessary. Yep. Thank you.
Terrific. Okay.
Sorry
Thank
about
you very
that,
much. No problems at all. Councillors, the recommendation is on page 38 and is on the screen in front of you right now. Are there any questions in relation to 105 Manning Road in Bentley? Councillor Bain.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. What will the EPA be assessing as part of the scheme amendment? Thank you.
Mr Bride.
Yeah, through Mr Mayor, it's a requirement of all scheme amendments to be referred to the Environmental Protection Agency. So they may have, they've got two choices, one to not assess the amendment, and the other one would be if there was an environmental issue. I don't believe there would be any environmental issues for this site, but they're best placed to assess that. The likely scenario is that they would deem it, the scheme, not assessed. So they would simply look at the amendment, realise there's very little to no environmental impacts, and provide the city that advice. And as soon as we get that advice, then we can advertise the amendment. So I don't believe that they would find any environmental impacts with this particular proposal. It's already developed land, there's a house on it. So I doubt whether there'd be any environmental impacts.
Councillor Barry.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. As the gentleman said before, I think the liquor licence is owned by the people who purchased the block next door. Can that go? Can that licence go next door?
Mr Bride, can they apply for the licence to be transferred?
Yeah, through Mr Mayor, obviously Council will be looking at the land use aspect. The Department of Racing, Gaming and Liquor will look at the licensing requirements. But as the applicant said, certainly they do look at the concentration of liquor outlets as part of their assessment, the Department of Racing, Gaming and Liquor. So it's easy to transfer those licences to the same operator in the same geographical location. So there shouldn't be an issue from that department's perspective.
Okay, just a question in relation to if it's R80, and I'm not quite sure how big that block is. It looks like it's probably easily a quarter acre. No? More?
I went past today. Do you know how big it is, Mr Bride? It looks about 900 or so.
Yeah, it's 837.8 square metres.
So from a residential perspective, how many residential dwellings could go on that block at R80?
Mr Bride?
Yeah, when you go above R40, there's no minimum lot area per unit, so it's based on plot ratio. So that really depends on the landowner and their architects, I guess, plans to lay out the units in a particular manner. So once you go for R40, it's based on the plot ratio, which is the amount of built floor area versus the lot area. R80's got a very high plot ratio, so the number of units would be dependent upon what the landowner and architect is looking to achieve. But I would suggest potentially 10 units or somewhere around that, potentially. Yeah.
All right.
Just for the sake of the record, Councillor Ponaturais left the meeting. She has another pressing appointment. Thank you, Councillor Barry. Any other questions on this item before we move past it? Thank you very much. Deputy Mayor.
Quickly. Change of use, would that represent any change in the rates that we get from the area? Is it an increase to go from residential to mixed use?
Mr Bride, is there any impact on rates?
Through Mr Mayor, obviously going from residential to commercial zone, yes, there would be a slight increase in the rates for that particular property.
Thank you. Councillors, we'll move on to EN 029 of 20. The responsible officer is Mr Warren Bowe at item 7.4 tonight, the Director of Canning Environment. The item number is EN 029 of 20. The title of the report being Burrendar Park Ancillary Works, Willetton Sports Precinct, Community Piazza, Stage 2, including Skate Plaza, contract award for construction of works. The officer's recommendation is on page 44 and is also on the screen. Are there any questions in relation to that matter? Councillor Barry.
Yes, if I could just have a brief explanation as how to the Welga E-Quotes works.
Mr. Bowe, are you able to give us a very short
Yes,
explanation of
I
how that
can.
actually works?
I'll do my best, Mr. Mayor. It's an electronic platform that Wagga operate. On it is their appointed contractors who have been obviously vetted through their procurement processes. There are a number of contractors who qualify to be on that panel, and when we have a tender or a contract of a certain value through our procurement framework, we're obliged to undertake an assessment of the methods in which we will procure that contract. The eQuote is in effect a platform for the Wagga preferred suppliers. So we in effect lodge our documents onto the platform, and those pre-qualified suppliers who are pre-qualified through Wagga have access to the documentation and would indicate whether or not they were willing to make a submission, or at least they register to receive the documents, and then they make a decision as to whether or not they wish to submit their price in line with a standard tender process.
So I note in here that 5 of the 6 that were on the Wagga panel are also on our panel. Is that correct, yeah?
Director Bowe?
Yeah, that's correct. And the value of this contract was over and above the value that we would necessarily administer through our own panel of suppliers. So hence we went through the Wagga eQuotes platform.
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
The value of this contract was over and above the maximum threshold that we would administer contracts via our panel, our local panel. So we went to the broader Wagga panel.
So how would we get around that in future if we needed to?
Director?
I don't think we would ever endeavour to get around it, Councillor Barry. When we appoint our panel of suppliers, when we appoint our local panel of suppliers, we appoint them under terms that in effect state a general amount of work, but we also appoint them based on the maximum value of a contract we would appoint under using our local panel. I don't know exactly what that value threshold is, or I can find that out for you. So say we have our local panel, we will say we will administer contracts up to a value of X $100,000 through our local panel. Anything over and above that threshold, we would go to either public tender or use the Wagga eQuotes platform.
So how does the Wagga process legitimise it, for want of a better word? If we can't do it, how can we go through them?
Director?
Well, we could choose to go through a public tender process and not use the Wagga eQuotes platform. That way, all and sundry, all contractors who may have the ability to deliver the work could make a submission through the normal tender process. We chose to go through the Wagga eQuotes platform, where they have a list of pre-qualified suppliers who are already vetted and appointed under that panel, and they will have the capability and competence and experience to deliver the scope of works that we're asking for.
So if we go through the tender process, then we can go up to that, whatever it was, $1 million.
No, if we go through
that we can't now under our panel.
We have a maximum threshold under our local panel.
Yes.
If the value of the contract that we're offering, such as the $1.2 million contract here, exceeds the value threshold of our local panel of suppliers, we would either go to public tender or use the Wagga platform.
So public tender would get you the ability to go to that.
Yes.
The only other question I ask is that given that 5 of them are on our panel and 2 of them declined to participate and the 6 didn't submit a tender, was there any sort of an exit review on that? Because it only means we end up with 3. Is 3 sufficient for what we need?
Director Bowe?
Yes, 3 is sufficient for what we need. We believe through the evaluation process that we've got good value for money based on the requirements of this contract. But just in answer to the first part of your question, Councillor Barry, when we appoint our local panel of suppliers, we would dictate the maximum contract that we would administer through our local panel. It's generally for lower value contracts. For your over $1 million contracts, we would we would not use our local panel for those types of contracts. We would go to a broader public tender or a WALGA platform.
So essentially 2 of the 3 that are on the WELGA E1 are on ours anyway. So they just go across to the E quotes and they're able to
That's correct.
tender for it.
That's correct.
Oh, all right. Okay. Ta.
Thank you. Any other questions, councillors, on that item before we move on? Thank you. We'll move to EN 030 of 20, parking controls, Woodthorpe Drive in Willetton. The recommendation is on page 53 and is on the screen. Are there any questions on that item, councillors? None. Thank you. We will move on to EN 031 of 20, local roads and community infrastructure, in brackets LRCI, close brackets program extension. The recommendation is on page 2 of the late circulated report and is on the screen right now. Any questions on that item? None. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to item CO001 of 20, City of Canning Homelessness Plan. The responsible officer is Dr. Sarah McQuaid, the Director, Canning Community, and that's item 7.5 on tonight's agenda. The recommendation is on page 63 and is also on the screen. Councillors, any questions in relation to the plan? Councillor Bain.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. In the state government's 10-year strategy, it states as one of the roles of local government is to coordinate volunteer and charity groups through a place-based approach that better meets the needs of people experiencing homelessness. I note that volunteer and charity groups are not directly referenced in the action plan. Are they considered local service providers? And will they have a seat at the table of the district leadership group meetings? Entities such as the Shopfront and the Cannington Soup Kitchen. Thank you.
Dr. McQuaid.
Thanks, Councillor Bain, through you, Mr Mayor. No, they would not have a direct seat at the district leadership group, but where under the action plan it states that the city will take an active role in providing opportunities for service providers and organisations to come together to meet and to discuss issues and to work collaboratively. Yes, most definitely those organisations as raised by you and other volunteer groups would be included.
Thank you. Any other? Councillor Bain.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Under the plan, could we also provide vulnerable people, and I'm thinking of when rangers interact with people experiencing homelessness, are we able to be in a position to give them brochures or pamphlets to let them know where they can go to get a free meal and at what time? Thank you.
Director McQuaid.
Thank you. Yes, we can. We currently have a pamphlet that we do hand out that provides a list of services and providers. We also, where we can, provide direct contact to those service providers. The intent is to update that service provider list on an annual basis so that we do pick up some of those other organisations and groups as well.
Thank you. Any other questions, councillors, before we close up? Councillor Kunza.
Through you, Mr Mayor, with respect to the internal budget, point 21, is it possible to actually understand both internally and externally how much we actually invest into areas of dealing with homelessness? Like there's a point internal budget and then it just says we'll fund it through operational budget. It doesn't really provide any information as to what we invest.
Dr. McQuaid.
Directly at this moment, I can't provide you a breakdown because we don't have a budget line that aligns directly to services for individuals at risk of or experiencing homelessness. We obviously provide it through our core community development work. Likewise, our community safety and ranger team, also it's part of their core duties to provide those supports and services. So at this stage, with where the plan is at and our advocacy role and our role in the connecting community organisations, bringing them together, the budget would be covered as per. If there were to be initiatives that were to come out of that work or through the district leadership group, that would come to council as a separate item. The $15,000 that have indicated at point 22 is for the development of the communications and marketing plan and the brochures, and don't have to hand the other items, but I can send a list of what that breakdown is at this stage. The intent would be going forward that we do start to monitor and break down and account for where the spend is so that we could, in later years, provide council with a figure of what's being spent directly.
Councillor Kunza.
Thanks for that. And also staff, because, I mean, it's not to say, it's so that we can understand, I guess, how much staff and resources, both whether we need to look at providing more services or less or whatever, so that we can consider that in the future.
Thank you, Councillor Kunza. Director.
Yes, we can start to look at that. At this stage, we believe we can start to work with it within the staffing that we've got. But as you see, the plan obviously is setting us up to start this journey and to see where we need to extend further. And with that would likely come extend resources that we would bring back to council as part of the budget process.
Thank you. Thanks, councillors. At item 8, we've got notices of motion for consideration at the next ordinary council meeting. There are none to discuss tonight. Urgent business, there is none. Confidential matters, there are no confidential matters on tonight's agenda. And closure, if there being no further business to discuss this evening, I now declare the agenda briefing closed. The time now is 7:06 p.m. and I'd like to thank everybody for their attendance this evening. Thank you.